right, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. What are we in the midst of discussing here, 1 Corinthians 10? What did he start with in chapter 8? Ron?
He's talking about eating the wheat that was offered up to sacrifices, and whether we have the authority to do that or not. Continue some of that within chapter 10 as well. And other matters related to that, it's very specific about it, when you should not eat it.
Right. There's this broader context of authorized liberties. Do you always exercise your liberty regardless of circumstances, situations of other people? And his definitive answer to that in 1 Corinthians 8, and really going into chapter 9, is no, you do not do that. The context, more specific, is this idea of eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he began with saying in chapter 8, well, we all know that an idol is nothing. That's true. But he comes back here in chapter 10 to give some clarity and very specific instructions about when it is appropriate and when it's not appropriate to eat. That sometimes eating meat sacrificed to idols puts you in idolatry, puts you in league with Satan. And so he defines that, and we're going to go through that and look at those things. My guess is we won't get through the whole chapter this evening, but let's begin 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's read 1 through 13. Who's got that? Ron, go ahead.
Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, unto whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it.
All right, so he, at the beginning of this, says, take warning, take heed, because the Israelites provoked God to wrath, and they suffered as a result of that. And he's bringing that up for a very specific reason about this idea of somebody who's a child of God can go awry, can turn God against them because of their unrighteous behavior. So, Israel, he says, enjoyed great blessings from God. So, when you see this here, he says, all our fathers under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. That's the first thing that he lists out there. And question number 1 was, explain the sense in which Israel was baptized unto Moses. There was a Mosaical baptism. But, Ron?
Well, one thing, as we know, baptism is an immersion, and it's described here that they were sanctified by the cloud, the sea that surrounded them. And it put them into a covenant relationship with God as a result of that. And they were brought from certain death unto life by that passage, or that means of spiritual baptism unto Moses that delivered them. So just as baptism delivers us from sin, and we're no longer slaves of sin, and we have a new life, so did Israel by the baptism that occurred for them by Moses, the cloud, and the sea.
Okay, so as he's talking about in the New Testament in particular, when you're talking about the baptism of the Great Commission, you're talking about a water baptism, immersion, fully submerged in that water, the burial, as it's referred to, Colossians 2. So you've got that regarding baptism in the New Testament. And here, it's talking about, they've got the water. They went through the Red Sea. They had water on either side. It mentions this cloud here. And when you go back to Exodus chapter 14 and you read that account, the cloud was between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. And so there's lesser of a reference to what we would think of as burial and coming up out of that. But as Ron was saying, what he's really driving at here is there's a change of this relationship. They went from one condition to another condition. And they went from being under the rule and reign of Pharaoh and being oppressed and mistreated by him to being under the leadership of Moses and entering into, when they get out into the desert, they get out to Sinai and that covenant is given, they enter into that covenant relationship. But it's this change of rulership, of headship, of who their master is that takes place there. And so he's pointing out this is what happened with them. They came under Moses, who's the great prophet of God. All the Israelites, all the Jews, anybody who knows anything about the Old Testament would look back to him. He's a towering figure in the Old Testament. He wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so he's the one through whom the law came. So they came up under that leadership. That was a great and amazing blessing that they enjoyed. Any other thoughts there? So they do that. What else did they do? Did they enjoy? Verse 3.
They had that manna that is compared to the spiritual food we have in Christ today. God literally fed them as we are spiritually fed.
Okay, so how did they get that manna?
Down from heaven.
Okay, it came down from heaven. And what did they do to actually get it?
And go gather each day from themselves and trust in God. And so one day we were supposed to do that. They were not to do that. People disobeyed that and spoiled that and taught us.
Right. And the thing about that is they did not have to plant, they did not have to tend, they did not have to harvest. God gave them that bread, that manna. And as Paul said, it was from heaven. It was a great blessing of God. It was a spiritual food in that sense that it came from Him. It was a miraculous event taking place. And that lasted throughout their wilderness wanderings. And then it stopped shortly before they went into the Canaan land. If memory's serving me right, I forget the exact timing, but it came to an end. But God miraculously provided that for them. What about this other thing he talks about, verse 4?
That's when Moses spoke to the rock and the water came out so that they had water to drink, because at that time they were having a hard time. There was no water around.
Right.
And they were starting their usual thing. We were better off in Egypt. But,
Yeah.
But then God, took pity on them, and He had the water come up. And of course, He likens it to Christ being the rock on which everything is founded.
Well, and he says that rock, that spiritual rock followed them. That rock was Christ. One of the things that speaks to is the pre-existence of Christ before He was born of Mary. His pre-existence and His intimate involvement in the Old Testament, in the people, with the people, with the covenant and all those things. He was there at that time. So you have a spiritual food, you have spiritual drink that they're partaking of. All these things miraculously provided by God. And when he brings up that rock was Christ, one of the things he's connecting here is they had a relationship with Christ. Though they didn't fully understand it, they did have a relationship with him. Not like we do, but it was there. And so what he's getting ready to hit them with is going to have more impact, understanding how those Israelites got crossways with God, and you can too when you do these particular things in the context. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But verse 5, what does it say about those people and about God?
Most of them were not God was not well pleased with them. That's why they were scattered all over.
Okay, how does that strike you, the way he words that there?
Dividing word.
What God asked. If we don't do what he asked, there is a condemnation that follows.
Oh, okay. We're going to see some of those specific things here in a second. Paul?
The bodies were scattered in the wilderness. They were buried all over.
Okay. John?
I think he's making the point that they saw some of the grandest miracles that man have ever witnessed. The sea being part of the Egyptians being destroyed, being fed on a daily basis, 3 square meals a day, having water directly from God. They had all these things. Despite that, they still fell. They still sinned. They still gave up all those great things for their own desires and complaint.
Yeah. And Ron, did you have something?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Stephen also. He references here, but with most of them. So the impression I have is the majority of them are classified here as God was not well pleased with them.
Okay.
So, what about this idea of once saved, always saved?
Not true. Once saved, always saved is absolutely not true, because they were saved in the baptism of Moses, but then they end up dying in the wilderness, not making it to the promised land. Nancy?
Well, along that same line in Jude 5, it says that you remember God brought them, you know this, God brought them out of Egypt and then later destroyed them, those who did not believe.
Mm-hmm.
But they were still Israelites, but they did not believe.
Right. And to this point, those being Israelites who did not believe, with most of them, you go back, he doesn't specifically mention it, but it's in here when they went, first of all, to Canaan, and they spied it out, and they came back. 10 of the 12 said, we can't do it. And only those 2 guys, out of all those people above, I think it was age 20, actually made it in. All the rest of them died in that wilderness. Their bodies were scattered because as they wandered about, they died. Well, that's where they were. And what that tells you is they didn't have a homeland. They were unsettled. They were constantly wanderers. They were vagabonds in that desert. And so just because they experienced this, to John's point, saw these miracles, were beneficiaries of it, had a relationship with God through Moses in that covenant, they still didn't make it. And when it says they died in the wilderness, again to emphasize they did not make it to the promised land. That ultimate goal, that land of rest, they did not make it. All right, so now then, thinking about that, how does that relate to Christians? Why is he bringing up they ate that spiritual food, drank that spiritual drink, they were baptized, so on and so forth? Tom?
Well, they were the chosen, right? They were the children of God. I punched my ticket, I'm in, right?
Right.
And even like today, Christians, I'm good. I'm going to heaven. I'm not necessarily good. It happened back then, it happened today. There could be a gazillion Christians, but all are followers.
Okay, exactly right. And John?
And Paul goes on in this chapter to make the point, that these things are here not just for an example, but for instruction. Because it would be shameful if we fell into the same trap and that we didn't learn from the mistakes that they made. Hebrews 4:11 says, "Let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience." So we do not want to do the same thing and repeat the same exact mistakes that they did. And that's what these Corinthians were doing. Is they were willing to, because of their own desires, they were willing to sin just so that they could do what they wanted to do.
Okay.
Stephen, I was going to comment on verses 12 and 13 in regards to your question, but I don't want to get...
Yeah, let's hold off on that. He brings up this baptism because the Corinthians had been baptized into Christ. Spiritual food, which he talks about later in the chapter, but he's bringing it up here. Well, you partake of the bread in the Lord's Supper. Spiritual drink. You partake of the fruit of the vine in the Lord's Supper. That's your spiritual food. That's your spiritual drink. You've been baptized. You have a relationship with Christ. But that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to do. That doesn't mean you can't provoke God's wrath to the point you do not enter into the promised land. Your body, so to speak, can be scattered in that wilderness, and you never reach that ultimate goal. So you need to take warning about that. You can still displease God even though you've been recipients of these great spiritual blessings like the Israelites of old were. So getting to question number 2, verse 6, and a little bit of verse 11 there. What is the value of the Old Testament for us? We touched on it, but let's explore it a little bit more. Mike?
It shows that whenever God writes stories about what happened, that He's honest with things. He doesn't make these people out to be superheroes or anything like that. They sin. The wrath of God was placed upon them because of it. We have stories of, like Samson. That's not someone we would accept, but yet he's mentioned as in the honorable of the faithful. And that's kind of, how God kind of takes an individual and measures that individual based upon, what he says, and he forgives and continues to work with that person or through that person as long as they're willing to do what God wants them to do. And you have a whole generation that just was willing to do it, so we can kind of learn from that as well about, grace and mercy and reciprocated love.
Very good. Rob?
2 other supporting verses that Paul uses in reference to this. One is in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. And he says, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scripture might have hope." And then in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24, he's therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So, to your question, these things are for our learning, for our admonition, and as the Scriptures teach us, we now are living in the fullness of time and are so blessed to have all of this before us because we see it clearly, not dimly.
Right. We have perspective. When they were living, they were going through it for the very first time. Us, we can look back and see all those things, see the good decisions, the bad decisions. We can see all of that, how God dealt with them. And so it's been recorded for our learning, for our instruction. And he says, there are things that they wanted, that they desired. He puts it as lusted after evil things. There were things that were unlawful that they wanted, they pursued, and God condemned them for that. There are lawful things that they pursued or wanted with the wrong attitude or in the wrong way at the wrong time. You can see that in various ways coming out. That, for instance, David moving the ark, that was not a problem, moving the ark. It was the way in which they moved the ark that was the problem initially. And so there were things they did. They just really didn't look to God, consult God, follow God, careful about those things. And so there are various times where the people in the Old Testament were punished and they suffered the consequences because they weren't doing God's things in God's ways. Mike?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that no matter what law there is, God expects that law that He placed down for us in this time to be obeyed. Same thing for them. He's always treated mankind with great justice throughout the ages.
Right, and great patience to give us time to learn and to correct and to make changes. Exactly right. All right, so question number 3, I asked you to search for the events mentioned in verses 7 to 10, explain how these connect to Corinth. So let's just jump into this. Should not lust after evil things as some of them, as they also lusted. And any thoughts on that? Can you think of a time when they yielded to intense cravings? Let's jump back to Numbers 11. Numbers chapter 11. And we've made this point before, but sometimes people think, well, the book of Numbers is just kind of dull. The book of Numbers has some of the most interesting, wild stories that there are in the Old Testament. In Numbers chapter 11, remember the people complain. It says, verse 4, let's read verse 4 through 6, please. Numbers 11, 4 through 6. Who's got that? Go ahead, Carter.
Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes."
Okay, what's the issue there?
Oh, they're getting tired of what God gave them. And so they're going back to, it was so much better in Egypt. We had everything we needed. We're stuck out here. You're just leading us around, and we don't know what's going on. They just, been out of shape and don't appreciate what they were given. They just, this isn't good enough.
Right.
I want something else.
Exactly. This manna. Oh, we're getting tired of eating this manna. And you think about that, food provided by God from heaven, and they're saying, we're tired of this. And it mentions this mixed multitude that's in among them. People today, they don't like the plainness of what God has revealed in the New Testament. Let's just say for worship, for instance. They don't like the plainness of it. Look, it's very simple. It's very basic. It's not the fancy, snazzy, attention-grabbing stuff that we see in the world around us. And so people are dissatisfied with it, and they want something more. Well, how did the Lord solve this problem of the people complaining about the manna? Nancy?
Oh, he sent them quail to eat.
How much quail?
So much quail that it was repulsive the way if they had to eat it, and it was coming out of their noses even.
He said, I'll give you so much, it's going to come out your nostrils.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, verse 33, but while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people in a very great plague. He called the name of the place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had yielded to craving. And so there's that first warning. How does that connect to the Corinthians? Don't lust after evil things as they also lusted.
Well, part of the story of the quail is excess.
Okay?
And that is also a large part of the story of idolatry. Excess in every form.
Yep. Excess in every form. And in his context, he's talking about them lusting after those idolatrous feasts, wanting to go, craving to be there. Maybe it's craving of the actual feast itself, or it's the craving of being with those people who were there, being a part of that event. But he's saying, look, you've got this craving that is not right. The Israelites had that kind of thing, and God punished them severely for it. So don't you do it. Beware, you're going to have a problem here. So verse 7, do not become idolaters. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. What's that referring to? It's a direct quote, John.
Well, in Exodus 24, they're at Mount Sinai, and they hear God speak directly to them. Moses refused with them what God expected, and they heard from God's own mouth to Moses, do not commit idolatry. Moses goes back up to get more word from God, and he's gone 40 days. It's too long for them, and they start building an idol to find what God had just told them, and they can see up on the mountain the glory of God, and they still decide to sin this way.
Exactly.
It's a direct quote from Exodus chapter 30, verse 6.
Okay. And what do the people do? What's it describing them doing here? Sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. It's a euphemism. This is one of the euphemisms that it's okay to use because it's a clean euphemism. It's not just whitewashing filthy language. They eat and drink. They're participating in an idolatrous sacrifice to that calf that they made. They rose up to play. They were involved in immorality, is what he's saying. That's what happened with the people there. At the foot of Sinai, to John's point, they could see God was present up there because of the cloud that was over Sinai. And remember that before they saw this cloud, the thunder, the lightning, all that going on. It scared them almost literally to death. Said, don't let God speak to us anymore. And the Corinthians now are being lured into joining into an idol's feast. So they 1 Corinthians 10 verse 7, don't become idolaters. They got out there in that desert. They heard God tell them, don't do it. They did it. You know you shouldn't be doing it, but here you are doing it. You go into the idol's temple, you're eating this, you are an idolater like them. Don't do that. All right, verse 8. Nor let us commit sexual immorality. Some of them did, and one day 23,000 fell. What's that a reference to?
Yes.
Linda?
Numbers 25.
Numbers 25.
Where the people started mixing in with the Moabites and being sexually immoral, and then they decided to worship Baal.
Okay, go ahead.
Just getting, making God furious. And finally, Phineas and the son of Eleazar, and the son of Aaron, I guess his grandfather. He took a spear in his hand. He saw one of these couples and threw it, and it went through both of them at the same time. And then, of course, he sent him away because it's like, to learn. I keep telling you, don't do this.
Okay.
And 25,000 people died before it was all over. This was the time. No, I think I'm something else.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
Well, and all this happens, they were at the border of the promised land. They were getting ready to go into the wilderness. They made it all the way through the wilderness for 40 years, getting ready to go into the promised land. They're knocking on the door of the promised land, just like we can do. We should be knocking on the door of heaven. And we can fall into this same trap. That's what Paul pointed to the Corinthians.
Yeah, and remember that all of this goes back to Balak hiring Balaam to come and put a curse on the children of Israel, but God wouldn't let that happen, and so he spoke blessings upon him. But Numbers 25, and then later the follow-up information that comes with it is that Balaam is the one that advised them to send the Moabites among them. And the way you're going to get God to condemn them is get them involved in idolatry, and God himself will curse them. I don't have to do it. God will do it. So that's the counsel that he gave. He ends up losing his life for it. But the Moabites get in there. They're committing sexual immorality. They're involved in idolatry. They're being lured into that. And as Linda said, God sent a plague. It was so bad that as they were there and in the presence of the Israelites and the people who were trying to do what's right, one man brought a Moabite woman in the presence of all of them, and that's when Phinehas jumped up with a spear and he skewered both of them. So he's saying, look, as John's saying, you can be right there and maybe these other things don't happen, but then you get lured into it. You get pulled away into this immorality that's intimately connected with idolatry, and the Lord is going to condemn you. The 23,000 in one day here in 1 Corinthians 10 is likely either it's rounding, because in Numbers it says 24,000, so it could be rounding, 23,500, whatever, one rounds up, the other rounds down, or it could be, as he specifies here, in one day, and the next day there were another 1,000 or so that died, something along those lines. John?
You had those that died from the plague, but then you also had some of them were to be killed. So the plague killed them, and also the leaders were. God told them that the leaders were to be killed, because it was the leader's son was the one that took the Midianite woman into the tent. So there's a lot of death. God and man were
right. God did not hesitate to kill that many people on the spot, so to speak, right there in one day. So, all right, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. What's that one about? Again, they had a real problem with this. What was it? Numbers 21.
Grabbing about food and everything that they just didn't have what they wanted.
Okay.
How come you're doing this to us? It's just the same thing over and over again.
And it's interesting, he's picked multiple examples now of when food was involved. You want this food, that physical craving that you have.
That's at one point in verse 5, it says, and we loathe this miserable food.
We loathe it. We loathe what God has given to us. Isn't that a warning? Loathing what God has blessed you with.
They were also complaining about some little extra things that they had to do. They couldn't go through the land of Edom. They had to go around. They didn't like it.
Nope.
It was the extras. They didn't want to do those extra things that God had instructed them to do.
And it's interesting that he notes they were tempting Christ on that occasion. So what are the Corinthians doing? Exactly. They're complaining. I want to go eat that idol's food. I don't see what the problem. Why are you having an issue with this? Don't tell me I can't do it. Exactly right. Complaining about these things and tempting and testing Christ. 1 Corinthians 10:10, nor let us complain as them also complain, were destroyed by the destroyer. Who's the destroyer? Nope. You know, some people have this idea that the devil has the power to take a life. That's not presented in the Bible, really. I mean, he can bring about, a storm or something, but God allows that to happen. But the destroyer in the Old Testament is what some describe as a destroying angel. There's an angel that God sends out to take life. So you think about Exodus chapter 12, when you had the death of the firstborn. It was an angel that went through the land and killed the firstborn. There was an angel that stood in front of Balaam when he was on that donkey with his sword. And he later told him, if that donkey hadn't have done what it did, I would have killed you by now. So there is an angel or angels that execute, as we have in the Old Testament written here, that would go and kill people, bring plagues. Remember the angel when David numbered the army, he numbered the Israelites, and there was the destroying angel over Jerusalem. That's what the Old Testament is presenting, and that's what he's talking about here. There were people who complained, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. That's that destroying angel is presented to us in the Old Testament. And what it's talking about, as you go back to Numbers chapter 16, you have Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and the others who are complaining about the leadership that God put in place, and they were destroyed. Remember that the leadership in their family, the ground opened up and swallowed them. Well, how'd that happen? Well, an angel made that happen, swallowed him up. And then you had the fire come out and kill the 250 men who were with him. Mike?
Also, in Job chapter 2, whenever Satan comes back to God and they're talking, and God says, have you considered Job? For you decided me, I decided against him. So he takes full responsibility of life and death.
Yeah, and he won't let him take Job's life. Yeah, he put a limit on that. So you have all these examples of the Israelites. He's saying, you at Corinth, you're walking down the same path. And what they got, you're going to get. Unless you change your mind, your attitude, your actions, and do God's will. Written for our admonition. Take heed, take it to heart. God is serious. We cannot be complacent about our duties and our obligations to God. We can't gripe and complain and be dissatisfied with the things that God has given us. Very often in our lives, we want something we don't have. Instead of being content with what we do have, we want something we don't have. When we're fine, everything's okay, we have what we need. They had the manna, so they were fine, they were going to live, everything's going to be all right, but they wanted something else. Not satisfied. We need to be careful, and we can't persuade ourselves that God's wrath is not a reality. It is a reality. We need to understand that there is a time coming when we're going to face Him in judgment. And if we've not lived right, if we've lived like the Israelites of old that He's giving examples of here, we're going to face that wrath. It's not as though God's going to say, didn't really mean it. I changed my mind. Everything's okay. He won't do that. He is going to bring punishment against us. So let's take heed to these things that he's writing to the Corinthians in a specific context. Let's take heed in our lives to these things. Anything else through 11? Ron, I'm going to get to 12 and 13 in just a second. All right, through 11. All right, 12 and 13. Ron, I'll give you the opportunity to jump in if you still have that comment in mind.
Well, as you were mentioning, the things that were contributing to this was the condition of their mental state, and much of that was about their self-assessment, their arrogance, their pride, their wisdom that they had, worldly wisdom versus spiritual wisdom, possession of the spiritual gifts that they had. But as you described here, Stephen, if that can happen to God's children that He brought out of Israel, out of captivity, that's the point that He wants them to understand about. Don't think you're going to stand, if you believe that you are on this premise of self-righteousness, because you will fall.
Yes, exactly right. Way too puffed up about themselves, their position. Do you have more?
Well, then in verse 13, I think the introduction of that verse is particularly important because these things happen let me stop for a second. Virtually from the creation of man, the sins that have occurred there are common even to us today. Throughout the entire ages, all of these things are common to all of us. Therefore, we are all susceptible to these sins. And I think that's the point he's making here. We're not unique. We're not special. We're not limited in a period of time that exempts us. This is all common to man.
Right. So, there in verse 12, one of the things he's pointing out, to Ron's point, is Christians have to remain humble and vigilant because Satan is looking for an opportunity to take us down. And so we need to always recognize that there is that vulnerability and therefore need to be on guard, and we need the Lord in our life. So question number 4, I had asked, note the promises made by the Lord in 10 verse 13. And I want to cover Ron's point a little bit more about this idea of temptation. Ron.
I just want to mention,
yes,
Stephen, as you commented, once saved, always saved is not a true doctrine. And verse 12 is another verse that refutes that. Exactly.
It's
described it.
Yeah, you can fall from grace. He's telling them very specifically, you're in danger right now. All right, so what about these promises that are made? What's the first one? Okay. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. Doesn't matter who you are, what the circumstance is, you are not facing anything that somebody before you has never faced. Ron mentioned you're not unique, right? I think that was the word. You're not unique. You're not being picked on. You're not being isolated out from the rest of humanity and facing a trial that nobody has ever faced. I know sometimes we get that in our mind, like nobody's ever had to deal with it. No. And that just having that thought in mind can help us realize it's not as bad or not as overwhelming as I think. Is it tough? Yeah. He's not saying it's not difficult. He's not saying it's not painful. He's not saying it's not a real thing. He's just simply saying other people have faced it. And if we know other people have faced it, what do we know? We can do it too. Yeah. Some of those people failed, and they failed miserably. But you know what? Some of those people actually resisted the temptation, and they're good. They're that example we want to follow after. So, no temptation. It's not like you have a unique temptation in your life. But that point that Mike made, what's that promise?
Whatever the temptation is, it's not something that we can't overcome.
Okay. The power of that temptation is not greater than our power to resist. In fact, it's less than our power to resist. That's why we can resist it. And God controls that, right? He puts a fence around Satan. He only allows Satan to go so far. And He knows us individually. And so He personally, He knows our limits. And He will not allow Satan to go beyond a certain point with us personally to where we can't resist that. So the temptation is not so strong that it exceeds our ability to resist. And what else does He do for us? There's an escape. Any observation on that? Paul?
Well, some of the temptations are mighty strong. Still yet, God's love for us should draw us towards Him, not to that temptation.
Yes, Mike?
It also shows the wisdom in fleeing. So
Fleeing. Any other thoughts?
Well, to me, the way of escape is God's word.
Okay.
If you find yourself wrestling with something that you know is wrong, you shouldn't be doing it. You go to His word and you get the strength that you need to resist it.
Okay. You can find the strength to resist the temptation in God's Word, just as Jesus did. Jesus, in temptation by the devil, recorded Matthew 4. He quoted the book of Deuteronomy each time to thwart the devil. But let me give you this. So, you have an important, well-paying job. Your boss, say the CEO of the company, wants you to lie in a report so the stock price doesn't tank. And you say, I am not going to do that. Well, if you don't do that, you're going to be fired. Well, you have a way of escape. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Sometimes that way of escape is very hard. But you have to take the way of escape. When Joseph took the way of escape in Potiphar's house, what happened to him?
he lost his job.
He not only lost his job, he lost his freedom and he was put in prison. So, understand that way of escape doesn't mean there's an easy out. Sometimes it means there are very real consequences you have to face, but you did the right thing and you escaped the sin, which is the primary thing. Linda?
Well, then that's when you have to remember that Jesus, said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added to you. In the context, he's talking about food, shelter, and clothing.
Right.
So you know that even, and as hard as that would be when you're facing it, you know if you're faithful to his commandments, you'll find another job will show up.
There will be a door open because you have to trust in God in these things. Exactly right. So, bottom line, chapter 10, verse 13 is we don't have an excuse for committing sin. The Word informs us of what is right and wrong. It gives us the power to deny temptations. We have that power that God has given us. There's a way of escape. We have warnings and examples of people who went before us and they sinned and what they had to face. We have examples of people who overcame and how they overcame and what they did and what the outcome of it all was. And we have promised blessings if we endure. So James 1 and verse 12, and we'll wrap it up on this. Go to James 1 and verse 12. Who will read that for us? Go ahead, Carter.
Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive a crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him.
Okay. There's that crown of life that awaits those who endure the temptation. That is, they bear up under it, they resist it, they don't give in to it. In the end, the Lord has a crown of life for you. And that's what Paul is telling the Corinthians. You need to resist this. You need to stay faithful. You can't give in to idolatry. You can't have excuses. You can't think that you're privileged in the eyes of God because of the spiritual gifts, because of the baptism, because of the Lord's Supper, because of all these things that God has given to you. You cannot be complacent about your relationship to Him. You have to stay on guard and resist that idolatry. All right. Any other thoughts before we wrap it up? All right, thank you all, Lord willing. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 14 to the end of the chapter next week.